exclusion, of injustice, perception of being excluded from political power, from access to natural resources, to land, to justice and security, is a major factor explaining conflict, and that fighting exclusion, having inclusive political and policy approaches, is of the essence. So what we see is that we don't have a linear transition or progress towards development and peace, that this transition can be reversed, and that we need to have more resilient systems, and resilient systems have to build on inclusive policies. Another shortcoming is that peace is not clearly defined. What is peace? As you know, in peace studies, there is a vast literature on negative and positive peace. But if we look at the discussion at international level, we see that peace is often equated with peace building or peacemaking, but very often also with stabilization and security. And peace is often equated with intervention at the global level, which are military and security interventions. And for a humanitarian organization like mine, like the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is a purely independent, impartial, neutral humanitarian organization, being directly associated in a triple nexus that embodies, encapsulates military and security objectives and agendas, is problematic. And I will come back to that a bit later on. So, let me come to what is a triple nexus that works to leave no one behind in a development model that is appropriate for fragile and conflict-ridden contexts, based on some conceptual clarification. When I was a student back in the 80s, things were more simple. And I think being a professor back then might have been more simple as well. We had clear ideas, and humanitarianism was quite different from development. I was told, well, humanitarian action is short-term and development is long-term. This is the first difference. Today, we see protracted conflict. I heard yesterday a podcast with President Trump, who was saying, I'm fed up of being involved in endless conflicts. What we see as the International Committee of the Red Cross is that the major conflict regions where we are operational, we have been operational there for an average of 36 years. So it's not only 1 or 2 decades, it's generations. And then the question for a humanitarian organization like the ICRC is, how do we adapt our response to make societies, to make vital infrastructure, public services more resilient to recurrent waves of violence? And how do we engage development actors, peace actors, in a meaningful manner, but always keeping our humanitarian space for neutral, independent, and impartial humanitarian action, whereby we are accepted by all the parties to the conflict on the ground. The second difference that was back then at a theoretical level quite clear is that development was really domestically driven, and development was requiring working with and through the states and local actors, national actors, who were in the driving seat, while humanitarian action was supposed to be more externally driven as a response to a crisis. And actually today this is not at all the case. More often than not, we, the International Committee of the Red Cross, we work to support local actors and national actors, to support local and regional, for instance, public utilities, the authorities, non-state actors, in being able to continue to provide essential support for markets to work, for essential services to be functional. So, if these two differences are not valid anymore, then we have a third difference, which I would contend is still valid to a certain extent. Development is transformational. Development is about social change, social transformation, which involve political, cultural, and social economic aspects. And humanitarian action is much more conservative. The main objective is just to save lives, to alleviate suffering, and to protect human dignity. Maybe the most transformative aspect of humanitarian action is to ask and demand from states and from combatants and armed actors to abide by international humanitarian law, to abide by the rule of humanity that sets limits in the exercise of armed violence. And because of this difference between the rather transformational agenda of development and the more conservative agenda of humanitarian action is unconditional. It responds to needs in an impartial manner, regardless of political consideration, of ethnic consideration, regardless of any other consideration than the intensity and the urgency of needs, whereas development has often, as you know, been conditional. So, if we look at this question of conditionality, it's quite important because actually, when we refer back to the triple nexus of bringing together humanitarian action, development, and peace, we have learned the hard way that to start with, we should try to avoid doing harm. And the do no harm mantra came really very much to the fore, you might remember, in the mid-1990s, because people were shocked to see that aid conditionality and development intervention in Rwanda contribute to trigger the genocide in that country. And for the international community, this was a shock to say, okay, if we want to do good and intervene with development and aid interventions, we have to think that these interventions should not fuel conflict and even fuel and trigger possible genocide. From there, we can, of course, look at synergies between these three aspects of the nexus. So from our viewpoint, from a humanitarian viewpoint, a nexus that works is where civilians and civilian infrastructure is protected even in the midst of conflict, where civilian infrastructure is made more resilient to adverse shocks and can withstand shocks, and where vulnerable people are included. So let me disentangle and bundle these different aspects. People and infrastructure needs to be protected during conflicts. Actually, international humanitarian law requests a distinction between military objectives that can be legitimate objectives in the conflict, in the context of an armed conflict, and civilians infrastructure that must be protected. And decision on how war and conflict is conducted can have a huge impact on post-conflict development and peace consolidation. Because violation of international humanitarian law breeds grievances, breeds exclusion, and this makes post-conflict recovery much more difficult and complex. And this explains why we have so many failed peace processes where grievances re-emerge just a few months or years after peace agreements are signed. So achieving the SDGs in these difficult environments requires not only parties to armed conflicts to abide by IHL, but it requires the international community of states to really become serious about their commitment under the Geneva Convention to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. And we have engaged states which have an influence on parties to the conflict in Syria, in Yemen, in Ukraine, and in many other countries, so that they exert influence on the parties to the conflict with which they have contacts, whom they might directly or indirectly support in the context of partnered operations. Second, we have to focus on the inclusion of vulnerable people and to listen to local actors. Development, again, tends to be more state-centric. Humanitarian action is more people-centric, and actually, by providing humanitarian action, we often focus in places which are either neglected or simply out of the reach of the state. And this is very important to be able to provide support, life-saving support, but also long-term resilience interventions in these places which tend to be marginalized. I will give you a number of examples of what we try to do with this regard. And finally, we try to build shock-resistant critical infrastructure and essential services through innovative partnerships which is absolutely of the essence to maintain life-saving services during shocks. So let me give you a few examples to become more concrete. I'd like to take a few examples from one domain of intervention, which is to ensure sanitation, provision of drinking water and wastewater treatment in urban areas, because conflicts and violence tend to be ever more urban and hit highly populated areas where humanitarian intervention and development intervention face completely different and somehow more complex challenges than in the former, more rural environment we were used to operate in. So in cities like Goma in the DRC or Marawi in the Philippines, we work with the authorities to develop new water master plans, water treatment as well as water provision master plans that take into account the huge demographic pressure related to the massive movements of populations. In the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, we have engaged the parties to the conflict so that they agree to preserve and not to attack the water pipes and the water pumping stations that flow across the front line. And this, to quite an extent, was extremely successful in order to be able to continue to ensure the provision of drinking water in the urban centers, which are in very sensitive areas. In Aleppo, in 2013, we saw that we were not able to maintain the existing water systems available to the population. So what we did is that we worked with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, but also with the local water board and local communities in Aleppo in order to restore broken wells that had been out of use for decades. And we have restored quite a number of water wells, and through an apps that was a geo-referenced apps that would indicate where the closest water well would be located for each and every household within Aleppo, we were able to indicate to the local population how to get access to drinking water even in the midst of the worst period of the conflict in Aleppo. So beyond these few examples, with just taking the example of water, we explore innovative partnership and financial models that brings together the investor community, the development community, and the humanitarian community. So this requires us, humanitarian actors, to be able to engage with development professionals, with academics, with businesses, to pool our expertise, skills, and resources to find better and new solutions for countless people whose need we cannot serve and service alone. An example is a new mechanism which is called the Famine Action Mechanism, the FAM, which has been launched by the World Bank together with the UN and the ICRC. And the idea is to intervene and prevent any food insecurity crisis before it reaches the stage of famine. So we pool the expertise of tech firms, including Amazon, Google, and many others. And these firms, what they do is that they help us strengthen the database that we have, as well as the capacity to treat and understand and make sense of data in order to have early warning signals and intervene much before the food insecurity translates into hunger and famine. We work with insurance and financial services industries that provide more predictable, sustainable funding in order to bring at scale these responses as soon as we have these forerunner signals that says that we have to intervene. And we are implementing these models now in South Sudan, in Somalia, in the Sahel. And this will be a model that will also be certainly spearheaded in Asia. So, just another example, I think, which is which speaks for itself, is that we have to now combine life-saving intervention with sustainability and development interventions. And in South Sudan, but also in the Sahel and in Nigeria, what we have done is that we have provided emergency food aid, including airdrops in South Sudan, for example, but at the same time, we provide drought-resistant seeds, tools to farmers, and we have worked with agro-pastoralists to make sure that we can extend veterinary services in zones of fragility, in zones of conflicts. And this seems not so exciting in terms of development models, but let me tell you that in South Sudan, we have vaccinated last year through the extension services, veterinary extension services, over 1 million cattle. And this is just the main and major assets for agro-pastoralists. And it makes a huge difference by allowing them to continue their economic activities and not falling fully aid dependent. So in terms of resilience, this is, I would argue, key. Last point is very important within a triple nexus that works to safeguard a space for independent, neutral, impartial humanitarian action. In places affected by conflict and violence, people may be left behind because of military front lines and political fault lines. And in these settings, it is important to have a space for neutral, impartial, independent humanitarian actors to be able to reach those left behind.